a partisan bill in the United States Senate. 3 out of 4 voters support the American Rescue Plan. This is a recent Morning Consult poll. It's been referred to before on the floor. 70% of all voters support the American Rescue Plan. Not surprisingly, there's some difference between Democrats and Republicans, but frankly, not much. 90% of Democrats support the American Rescue Plan. 60% of Republicans support the American Rescue Plan. Why? Because everybody is hurting in this country. Everybody is hurting. Republicans and Democrats need an extension of unemployment benefits. Republicans and Democrats both want cash payments. Republicans and Democrats know that their kids can't get what they need in schools without additional supports. This is a unifying proposal in the American public. President Biden made a commitment to govern in a way that unified the country. He's done that. He's proposed a bill that has the broad support of Republicans and Democrats. I don't know that it's his fault that it can't draw Republican support in Congress, despite the fact that it draws Republican support from the public. And finally, Mr. President, this was maybe the most interesting theme of the complaints. It's not COVID relief. I've heard different statistics thrown out by my Republican friends. Some of them suggest only 5% of this bill is COVID relief. And I'm not sure exactly how they come to that calculation, but what I understand them to say is that anything that isn't directly related to putting shots in people's arms or treating people with present cases of COVID is not COVID relief. Well, let's just take a look at what was broadly part of the CARES Act that was supported by every single Republican and what is broadly part of the American Rescue Plan. Because my Republican colleagues thought that everything in the CARES Act was COVID relief, whether it was designed to immediately attack the healthcare crisis or whether it was designed to address the economic crisis. There were stimulus checks in the CARES Act, not as big as the ones in the American Rescue Plan, but they were COVID relief when we passed the CARES Act. Now, according to Republicans, they're not COVID relief. There was an unemployment extension and a plus-up in the maximum benefit under the CARES Act. That was COVID relief back in March of last year, but now, according to Republicans, it's not COVID relief. There was money for vaccines and for testing in the CARES Act. In the American Rescue Plan, money for vaccines, testing. Small business relief was, of course, conceived in the CARES Act, the PPP program. That's a big part of the American Rescue Plan, but now it's not COVID relief, according to my Republican colleagues, whereas it was last year. There was state and local funding in the CARES Act. There's state and local funding in the American Rescue Plan. There was rent and mortgage relief in the CARES Act. There's rent and mortgage relief in the American Rescue Plan. All of a sudden, since Democrats took control of the White House and took control of the Senate, all of these things, which were categorized as COVID relief by Republicans in March, are no longer COVID relief. You're just supposed to think of these as extras, as Democratic priorities. 90%, 95% of what's in the package we're voting on today is simply an extension of the same set of funding streams that we authorized in a bipartisan way a year ago. And so this idea that this is some Democratic wish list when we are essentially just extending or increasing the same funding streams that were in the CARES Act is nonsense. It's nonsense. Of course this is all COVID relief. Of course it is COVID relief when you are increasing nutritional benefits to people who can't afford to feed their kids because they've lost their job or they've lost hours because the economy melted down due to a pandemic. That is not all of a sudden not COVID relief today. This one is maybe the most bizarre of Republican claims. This bill is expensive, but it is not too expensive. This moment is unique, and we are mandated by our oath of office to meet this moment. Republicans didn't have a problem spending $1.9 trillion to give tax breaks to their wealthy friends, I don't know why they all of a sudden have a problem putting money into the pockets of hardworking Americans who are suffering through the worst health care crisis this country has seen in a century. Republicans say this is a partisan bill. Out there in America, guess what? It is not. It is not. Republicans and Democrats support this because it's full of common sense ideas that make a lot of sense to people no matter what their political ideology is outside of Washington. Republicans say this bill isn't COVID relief, it's a Democratic, progressive wish list. No, it's simply an extension of the things that were bipartisan priorities last year. We thought they were good ideas then. We think they're good ideas now, especially given the fact that 3 to 4 times as many people are dying today as were dying in March of 2020 when we passed the first bipartisan CARES Act, where the economy today is in just as dire straits as it was. Submitted that I hope we are turning the corner. I hope that we get vaccines into the arms of individuals such that we are soon back to the numbers of deaths per day that we saw in March of last year. I hope that we are on a road again to full employment, but I am confident that none of that can happen unless we make this investment in COVID relief and in economic relief. It is an obligation as stewards of the economy and the welfare of the American people for us to step up to the plate and get this done this week. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, Senate in a quorum call.
We are not.
Mr. President, less than 2 months ago at his inauguration, President Biden spoke about his deep commitment to bringing Americans together. Today, the Senate will consider the first major bill of his presidency, an intensely partisan piece of legislation. Why is the bill before us today so partisan, Mr. President? It's not because Republicans were unwilling to cooperate with Democrats on COVID legislation. In fact, Republicans made it very clear that we were willing to work with Democrats. No, the bill before us today is so heavily partisan because Democrats didn't want to work with Republicans. Democrats saw an opportunity to use the COVID crisis to advance a whole host of liberal priorities. And they were afraid that allowing Republicans to participate in the process would mean that some of their pet projects would be excluded, or that they would have to pare back some of their more profligate spending. So Democrats decided to use reconciliation to ensure that Republicans wouldn't be able to interfere with their Democrat legislation. And let's be very clear about the nature of that legislation, Mr. President. Democrats would like to present this as a COVID bill. It's not. Yes, there are a handful of true COVID priorities in this legislation, like more money for vaccines and coronavirus treatment, something that I think everybody here on both sides of the aisle supports. But the bulk of this bill is either non-COVID related or ostensibly COVID related, but actually either unnecessary or excessive. On the non-COVID front, there's the $86 billion bailout for multi-employer pension plans. The billions for climate change and other environmental policy issues. A new taxpayer-funded leave program for government employees with no requirement that it be used for COVID-19. And I could go on, Mr. President. The version of the bill that came over from the House contained such non-COVID related measures as $100 million for an underground rail project in the House Speaker's home state, and $1.5 million for a bridge in the Democrat leader's home state, plus a massive increase in the federal minimum wage that would cost an estimated 1.4 million jobs, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and potentially devastate small businesses already reeling from the effects of the coronavirus. And then there are the ostensibly COVID-related measures like $350 billion for states, I should say. So what's the big problem there? Well, states don't need anywhere near that much money to weather the rest of the pandemic. The vast majority of states are not in crisis. And rescuing those states that are not in crisis would not take anywhere close to $350 billion. Democrats are going to spend hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars on an unnecessary giveaway to states. And on top of that, Mr. President, that giveaway is heavily weighted in favor of blue states. That's right. The distribution formula is designed to heavily favor Democratic states. Well, then there's the money for schools. Now, Republicans have been very willing to give schools money to help them reopen. In fact, last year, when Republicans were in the majority, which, by the way, during that time, we passed 5 COVID relief bills, all with bipartisan cooperation and support at the 60-vote level that we use here in the Senate for most legislation that we take up under regular order. But we put a lot of money into giving schools money to help them reopen. In fact, Republicans voted for $68 billion for K-12 schools. And at this point, Mr. President, that money is sufficient. Schools have spent just $5 billion of the $68 billion that we've already provided. Let me repeat that. So far, schools have spent just $5 billion, or less than 10% of the $68 billion that has already been given to them. Yet the Democrats' bill would appropriate an additional $129 billion for schools, 95% of which, Mr. President, would be spent after this year. The year of the crisis, the year of the emergency, the year of the pandemic. You would think if this was a crisis that the funding would be made available to be used this year, but it's not. It gets spent in the years 2022 to 2028. Do Democrats really expect Americans to believe that school dollars that won't be spent until 2027 or 2028 are urgently needed coronavirus response dollars? This is the pattern with this bill, though, Mr. President. We just passed a large coronavirus relief bill in December, the 5th coronavirus relief bill Congress has passed, and a lot of the money from that bill hasn't been spent yet. In fact, a lot of money from earlier coronavirus bills hasn't been spent. Yet Democrats are throwing massive additional amounts of money at various recipients with no idea, no clear idea of whether or not that money will be needed, or in some cases, when we know very well that that money isn't needed. Mr. President, Republicans will be introducing amendments to Democrats' bill. I'm introducing an amendment to undo the Biden administration's freeze on the coronavirus food assistance program, which has provided support for farmers and ranchers who've been hit hard by the pandemic. I hope some of my less extreme Democrat colleagues will join Republicans to advance some of our amendments, like Senator Graham's amendment, to change the distribution formula for states to the formula used in the Bipartisan CARES Act, which passed unanimously here in the Senate, so that both red and blue states would get a fair shot at funding, or amendments to remove those provisions that are in no way related to COVID relief. Unfortunately, Mr. President, Democrat leaders have made it very clear that they're not willing to entertain Republican ideas So I don't have a lot of confidence that Republican amendments, even if adopted, will end up in the final bill. Mr. President, it's deeply disappointing that pretty much the first thing Democrats did this Congress was to take a bipartisan process, coronavirus relief, and make it partisan. All five of the coronavirus bills that Congress has passed to date, last year, Republicans were in the majority, were bipartisan. This bill could have been bipartisan too. But Democrats decided that Republicans and the Americans that they represent should not have a voice in this legislation. Is this what the rest of the Biden presidency is going to look like? Boy, I sure hope not, Mr. President, because it's going to be really hard to come up with solutions that are durable and that represent the middle of the country, those people whose voices are not heard in the legislation that we will be taking up today. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator for Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to talk for a few minutes, Mr. President, about the good people of China, about Confucius Institutes, and the Chinese Communist Party. I meant what I said when I referred to the good people of China. You visited China, Mr. President. The people of China are wonderful people. They're engaging, they're smart, they have great sense of humor. They've built an extraordinary economy. I wish I could say the same about their authoritarian government, but I can't. The Communist Party of China is trying to not only swallow China, it's trying to swallow the world. We helped China be admitted, we helped the Communist Party of China be admitted to the World Trade Organization. We were told that if we did, they would embrace free enterprise. We were told that the Communist Party of China would be a valuable participant in a stable world order. None of that has come to be the case. We know what the Communist Party of China has done to Hong Kong. We know what the Communist Party of China has done to the Uyghurs. We know what the Communist Party of China has done to the wonderful, wonderful people of Tibet. But I did want to make that distinction between the authoritarian government, the Communist Party of China, and the Chinese people. The Communist Party of China, being as aggressive as it is, has for a number of years reached out to our colleges and universities to establish what the Communist Party of China calls Confucius Institutes. And this was the pitch made by the government of China to our universities. We will give you bucket loads of money if you, our universities, American universities, will allow us to establish Confucius Institutes, where we can explain our culture to the young people of America, where we can have a free exchange of ideas, and where we can help young Americans learn the Chinese language if they would like. Boy, that sounds great. You know, I'll take a dozen of those. But the Communist Party of China, being the Communist Party of China, that's not how our Confucius Institutes have worked out. These institutes run by the authoritarian government of China will not allow the free exchange of ideas. They will not allow anyone to talk about the Uyghurs or the people of Tibet or Hong Kong or what happened at Tiananmen Square. They meaning the Communist Party of China, has used these Confucius Institutes as propaganda arms of their government. Now, many of our universities have done the right thing. They've said, nope, We stand for the free exchange of ideas. And if you're going to come on our campus and tell our people that there are things that they can't talk about, then respectfully, the Confucius Institutes, need to leave our campus. But some of our universities haven't done the right thing. I'm not suggesting that, I'm not cynical enough to suggest that it's all about the money, but you can't ignore the fact that I think the Communist Party of China has given our universities through the years, don't hold me to this figure exactly, but about $150 million to set up these Confucius Institutes. And universities, they build that money into their budget, so they're reluctant to see the Confucius Institutes leave. Not all of our universities, but some of them. I recognize the economic reality. I have a bill that would say we wouldn't get rid of Confucius Institutes. It would just tell our universities that you've got to properly manage them. You can't allow the Confucius Institutes to stay on your campus if the Confucius Institutes will not allow for the free exchange of ideas. If kids, I shouldn't call them kids, if young people in our universities want to talk about Tibet, they get to talk about Tibet. And the bill would say that the universities have to take back control of these Confucius Institutes from the Communist Party of China. Otherwise, they're not going to be eligible for federal funds. Now, my bill, once again, it doesn't kick anybody off campus. It just says the Communist Party of China, has got to do what you originally told us you were going to do. Our bill, because the Senate passed it twice. Twice this bill's passed the United States Senate. The last time, with bipartisan support, we put the bill on the NDAA. And Mr. President, you know how conference committees work at the NDAA. Sometimes it's a ferret fire drill, and there's a lot of confusion, and somehow the Confucius Institute bill got watered down to do nothing in the conference negotiations on the NDAA. I'm not criticizing anybody, but it happened. So I'm going to ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass the Confucius Institute Act for a third time, and hope in our new Congress we can keep teeth in it in working with our colleagues, not only in the Senate, but in the House. And toward that end, Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-590, introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-590, a bill to establish limitations regarding Confucius Institutes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, since we've got a few minutes here, I think Senator Sanders is supposed to be next. Am I right about that, Megan? I just thought I'd spend a few minutes to talk about President Biden's coronavirus bill. Let me see if I can explain why so many of my Republican colleagues, and I'm part of that, are disappointed in the bill. This bill will be our sixth coronavirus bill. I don't think anybody, any fair-minded person, can accuse the United States Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, of not trying to respond to this devastating virus and the economic problems that it has created. And I've been very proud that in the first 5 bills, we did it on a bipartisan basis. We spent a lot of money about $4 trillion. That's 4 taxpayer dollars. And of course, we don't even have 5% of that. We borrowed every bit of it. Just a staggering sum. But we did it because we had a crisis and we had to deal with it. That's what we were sent up here to do. We did it on a bipartisan basis. But the last bill, President Biden's most recent bill, what we called the $1.9 trillion bill, we haven't done on a bipartisan basis. And I'm disappointed in that. I understand politics. You do too, Mr. President. But I listened very carefully to President Biden and throughout the campaign and in his 6 weeks of his administration. And he said very clearly and repeatedly, I want to work with everybody. What I heard him say to the Republicans was, I want to meet you halfway. I don't mean any disrespect, but if that's the case, either he or the people around him are not a very good judge of distance. It's been made very clear to us that there will be no negotiations on this bill, that President Biden decided to proceed through reconciliation, which only requires a majority. And I think we both expect, Mr. President, there to be 50 Democratic votes in favor of this bill and 50 Republican votes against it, and Vice President Harris will break the tie. And that's not a bipartisan bill. And I do. I regret that. And I think it could have been different. We can debate about whether we need $1.9 trillion, and I understand there are good arguments on both sides. I've heard the arguments, and I've listened carefully to my Democratic friends explain why they think we need it. There's another side of the story, and that is that, thank the Lord, we enjoyed 4% GDP growth last quarter. Most economists reckon that we will have about 6% GDP growth this year. The American people have about $1.6 trillion in excess savings. We have all this liquidity that as soon as it is allowed to be released is going to stimulate our economy substantially, in my judgment. Everyone involved is doing a wonderful job on the vaccines. President Trump's team did a wonderful job. President Biden's team is doing a good job. The governors seem to be doing a great job. People are getting vaccinated. We know that we have a lot of people in America who had the virus and didn't even know it. We're rapidly approaching the point where either through vaccination or people who've had the virus and therefore had the antibodies, that we're going to have way over a majority of the American people protected. And so one point of view is that we don't need to spend $1.9 trillion. But there was a middle ground here, Mr. President. And I'm disappointed that the president took the position that, look, we need to spend $2 trillion right now, even though there's $1 trillion at least in previously appropriated funds that we haven't spent yet. Now, a reasonable approach would have been to say, do we really need to spend $2 trillion? Maybe we ought to spend the other $1 trillion and see if that'll do it. Another reasonable approach would have been to say, maybe we ought to reprogram some of the $1 trillion that hasn't been spent. For example, we appropriated, I think, about $70 billion to our elementary and secondary schools. They've only spent $4 billion. So why are we giving them another $160 billion in President Biden's bill. Maybe, I'm not saying it's the case, but we ought to explore it. Maybe the schools didn't need the full $70 billion we gave them if they've only spent 4 or 5. So maybe we could reprogram some of that money. Now, if we had this money sitting in a checking account, I would still think, because it represents a scarce resource, I would still think that that we would need to take a look at the money we've already spent and either spend it if it's well placed or reprogram it before we go out and spend $2 trillion. But we don't have the money in a checking account. We're going to borrow every penny of this money. $2 trillion. That's going to bring debt up to 27, 28, 29 trillion. And we know, Mr. President, that right behind it is going to come a green infrastructure bill. And I'm hearing that could be $2 to $3 trillion more. At some point, we're going to run out of digits. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to change the name of the Department of Treasury to the Department of the Debt because there's no treasurer left. It's all debt. The other thing that bothers me about the bill, Mr. President, President Biden, and again, I understand politics, he has marketed this bill as an emergency. It's an emergency. We have to do it now. Right now, we need $1.9 trillion to deal with the economic crisis caused by the lockdown. And I understand that argument. And that there clearly are some Americans who need help. But if what the president is saying is accurate, then why is so much of the money not even going to be spent until a year from now? I look at the bill and I say, if all that's true to deal with an immediate crisis, why are we giving money to states and local governments that have actually seen their revenues go up? Why? There's no crisis. And I look at the bill and I ask myself, why are we giving money to bail out pension plans? Can we talk about this? And I look at the bill and I say, why, as I just alluded to, why are we giving I think that's the figure, Mr. President, $160 billion to our elementary and secondary education institutions when we've given them $70 billion in the past and they've only spent $4 billion? Where's the fire? They've got $65 billion or so left. This is real money. There's no money fairy. And I look at the bill. I mean, I want to help the American people. Gosh, many of them do need help. But should we really be sending stimulus checks to people who've never missed a paycheck out there? Do they really need the money if they haven't been laid off? If they've been paid the entire time of the lockdown? Why are we doing this? Couldn't that money, first of all, one option is not to spend it if there's not a need and pay down our debt, or at least not increase our debt. Another option would be spend it on something that we really need. And I've come to the conclusion I'm not trying to be mean-spirited, but that's why I say calling this a coronavirus bill, it's like calling Harvey Weinstein a feminist. This isn't a coronavirus bill, not the way it's been portrayed. Now, the American people still have needs. We still have some folks, primarily in the leisure industry, in the travel industry, who need our help. They do need help. We have a lot of folks who lost their job through no fault of their own unemployment is about to run out. They need our help, and we ought to help them. But the right way to do this, Mr. President, is to sit down as a body, Democrats and Republicans, and go through our needs, not our wants, because that's another problem with this bill. It's more wanty than needy. Go through our needs, and let's discuss how much money we should appropriate to those needs in light of the fact that we've already spent $4 trillion and we have a bunch of money left over. And that's not the way this is being done. This is just being rammed down our throats. This is just raw gut politics, which I understand. I've been around it. You have too, Mr. President. We've both been around the block a few times. But that's not how you allocate scarce resources. And the final point I'll make, you know, I know when we did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we meaning the Republicans, we went through reconciliation. We did. And so a fair-minded person might be thinking, well, Kennedy, you know, how can you criticize your Democratic colleagues for using reconciliation if you did it? And that's fair, except when we did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we asked our Democratic friends in leadership, can we sit down and see what we can put together? And we were told no. We don't want to reduce taxes. And that's not what happened this time. You know, 10 of my colleagues, I wasn't invited, and that's okay, but 10 of my colleagues went to the White House and visited with President Biden for 2 hours. And came back and said, you know, I think he may want to put together a bill together, and we're excited, and was going, yay, that's great, wonderful. And then next thing we knew, White House issued a statement and said our idea of unity is to do what we say, don't ask questions. And we both thought, no, that's not unity. So all this could have been avoided, Mr. President. It all could have been avoided, and I think we're going to end up spending money that doesn't need to be spent right now. I think we're going to end up spending money where we don't need to spend it. And I'm so glad that Senator Schumer withdrew his bridge project and that Speaker Pelosi withdrew her Silicon Valley subway. That's just spending porn as far as I'm concerned. But in any event, Mr. President, I wanted to get that off my chest. We're going to go through a vote-a-rama where we all offer amendments. Maybe together we can make this bill better and get rid of some of the spending porn, as I call it, and do the job that the American people sent us here to do. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I don't see Senator Sanders. I'm sorry. I yield to my good friend, Senator Peters.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, as we near the 1-year anniversary of the coronavirus pandemic gripping our country, there's no question that Michiganders and people all across our country are still hurting. While we're making important progress in the fight to combat this virus, this public health and economic crisis continues to take a significant toll on families, workers who are out of a job, educators, students, small businesses, hospitals, and communities all across our country. We passed targeted temporary relief in December, but we knew at that time that that was not going to be enough. We need more robust, meaningful relief. We must act quickly to meet the urgency of this moment by swiftly passing the American Rescue Plan. This is about relief for Michiganders and Americans who are reeling and are trying to make ends meet, funding to help schools safely reopen, sources to speed up vaccine distribution, and support small businesses fighting to stay afloat. I continue to hear from Michiganders from all across the state who are struggling to put food on the table, and pay their rent, and keep the lights on. These folks are not asking for a handout. They simply want a lifeline to get to the other side of the pandemic. When we passed $600 relief checks in December, I pledged that we must do more and that we could do that by providing people with an additional $1,400 to fulfill the promise of $2,000 in relief funds. With the American Rescue Plan, the majority of Michiganders and Americans who receive these relief checks in December are going to be eligible once again. This bill would mean a family of four could receive an additional $5,600. That support is vital to make sure that people don't fall into poverty as a result of this pandemic, and that they can get back up on their feet as quickly as possible. We know that millions of workers across our country, including workers in Michigan, are on the verge of seeing unemployment benefits expire on March 14th. We cannot abandon folks who are out of work through no fault of their own because of COVID-19. They have seen this pandemic disrupt their jobs and their incomes. The need for unemployment assistance is widespread, and it is necessary in Michigan. For example, there were over 840,000 active claims for Michiganders for unemployment assistance in Michigan just in February. That's up from 529,000 in January. And these claims for assistance come from every single county all across our state. We need to act now so these individuals remain eligible for unemployment benefits, including if they were self-employed workers, like small business owners, freelance workers, independent contractors, or gig workers. We must ensure families receiving unemployment have enough assistance to get by, which is why I support an additional $400 in weekly benefits. We also need to provide certainty that this assistance will continue to be there for them in the months ahead, not just for the next few days. The American Relief Plan will do just that by bolstering our state unemployment programs with additional federal support through August 29th. To help families get back to work, we all know that we must also safely reopen our schools. Many parents and educators are struggling to assist children through lessons while juggling other work and caregiving demands during the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan reflects a point of consensus that we want our students to return to in-person learning as quickly and as safely as possible. And the more resources that we can provide, the better. In response to the negative impact that COVID-19 has had on education, a stronger and urgent investment in our schools is absolutely critical for achieving safe operations and recovering from gaps in learning. That is why the American Rescue Plan is absolutely essential. This legislation will provide $170 billion in emergency funding to our schools and to our students, with $130 billion for K-12. The funding will help schools take steps based on science and recommended by the CDC to ensure that students and educators can safely return to the classroom. This includes repairing ventilation systems, reducing class sizes, and implementing social distancing guidelines, purchasing personal protective equipment, and hiring support staff to care for students' health and for their well-being. Every family and community has been facing a very unique set of challenges, and we need to provide robust funding so schools and parents have what they need to keep children connected with learning opportunities that are both safe and effective. And while these are important steps, we also know that if we're going to come back stronger from this pandemic, we also need to support the very backbone of our economy, which is our small businesses. While we have passed several rounds of relief for small businesses, Too many of our hard-hit small businesses are still reeling, from restaurants to boutiques to family-owned and minority-owned businesses. The American Rescue Plan has significant small business relief, including $25 billion in grants for restaurants and bars that have lost revenue because of the pandemic, $15 billion for economic injury disaster loan advance grants, $7 billion in funding for Paycheck Protection Program loans, and expanded eligibility for nonprofits. Additionally, this package reauthorizes and provides $10 billion in federal funding, including $1.5 billion specifically for minority-owned small businesses to the State Small Business Credit Initiative. I was proud to help establish this program in 2010 while serving in the House of Representatives. This program is a proven success, and in Michigan, it has helped small businesses create or retain over 12,000 jobs, and it strengthens state programs that support financing of small businesses, allowing them to both grow and to create more jobs. I am pleased to again champion this program, and with additional investment, it will again provide crucial support to small businesses in Michigan and all across our country. And finally, to completely get this pandemic under control, we must ramp up the distribution of vaccines. That's one of my top priorities as chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. And thanks to the extraordinary work of our scientists, our researchers, and our vaccine makers, especially those in my home state of Michigan, we now have 3 safe and effective vaccines. But I know that many people have been frustrated and darn right angered by the difficulties they've had in trying to secure vaccines for their loved ones or for themselves. But I'm encouraged that President Biden and his administration have been working tirelessly to expand vaccine production and speed up vaccine distribution. But to get those additional vaccines into people's arms, it will take additional resources. Through my work on the Senate Homeland Security Committee, I have been leading the charge to ensure that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has the essential staff, supplies, transportation, and other resources necessary to ensure that every vaccine dose is actually reaching an arm in this country. I have spoken with President Biden both in the Oval Office and at the Pfizer vaccine facility in Portage, Michigan, about the critical need to expedite the deployment of vaccines and do everything in our power to ensure vaccines are free and widely available in every community as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The American Relief Plan includes $50 billion to help FEMA support a national vaccine program to efficiently administer vaccines, including underserved communities. It also provides frontline medical professionals the personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and workforce needed to slow and to eliminate the spread of COVID-19. All of these resources are mission critical, as FEMA plays a leading role in assisting the federal government's response to COVID-19 by coordinating medical supply acquisition and distribution, and assisting state and local governments with funds for response activities, such as vaccine distribution and overtime pay for public health officials. As we consider the American Rescue Plan, there are signs of hope, particularly with ramped up vaccine production. We are beginning to emerge from a very dark winter, but our work is not done. We cannot be complacent. We cannot let up. This virus does not take a day off, and so neither can we. We must pass the American Rescue Plan. This package is not only what the American people need, but it is what they want. There's widespread support across the country for this package, from mayors to governors to economists across the political spectrum and the majority of the American people. We must deliver comprehensive and urgently needed relief, so we can do just that by passing the American Rescue Plan. This package will not mark the end of our efforts to crush this virus, but it will provide a massive shot in the arm to help families to safely open up our schools and to accelerate the development of more vaccines. So with that, Mr. President, I urge all of my colleagues to support the motion to proceed and final passage. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Vermont.
Do I ask for the quorum call to be vitiated?
Without objection.
All right. Mr. President, later today or tomorrow, as part of the American Rescue Plan, which we will be discussing in the next few days, which I happen to believe is the most significant piece of legislation to come to the floor of the Senate in decades in terms of addressing the crises facing working families. As part of that piece of legislation, I will be offering an amendment to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, which I believe is a starvation wage, to $15 an hour over a 5-year period, 5 years. And I think there's been some miscommunication around here, and there are people who are saying it's going from $7.25 to $15 an hour in 1 year. Not true. It goes from $7.25 to $9.50 to $11 to $12.50 to $14 to $15 an hour. So anyone who says we're raising the minimum wage in 1 year in the midst of a pandemic to $15 an hour is simply not telling the truth. Mr. President, this amendment is similar to a bill which I have brought forth, the Raise the Wage Act, which I am proud to say has been co-sponsored by some 38 members of the Senate, and this is also similar to legislation which has already passed the U.S. House of Representatives, and I thank them and I thank my friends in the Progressive Caucus in the House for doing a great job in pushing this legislation. I should also add for my Senate colleagues that this legislation raising the minimum wage is supported by some 300 national organizations, including the 12 million members of the AFL-CIO and virtually every major union in this country. This is something that unions like the SEIU, one of the largest unions in this country, have been fighting for a very long time. And I should also add here that while raising the minimum wage is going to impact every low-wage worker in this country, because African American and Latino workers often are earning poverty wages, it significantly impacts the lives of the minority communities as well. And that is why, among so many other organizations supporting this amendment, it is supported by the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It is supported by the National Organization for Women, because again, when we talk about low-wage workers, we're talking about the minority community. We're talking about women. And that is why it's supported by groups like UNIDOS, the American Association of University Women, Indivisible, Justice for Migrant Women, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the National Women's Law Center. So once again, this is legislation that will increase wages for 30 million American workers. And if you ask me what the great economic crisis in our country is today, it's not just high unemployment, it's not just income and wealth inequality. It is that half of our people today and before the pandemic were living paycheck to paycheck. Their wages were so low that if they had a problem with their car or their kid got sick, suddenly they were in financial crisis. And in the richest country in the history of the world, half of our people should not be facing economic desperation when their car breaks down. And the reason for that is significantly that many millions of workers are earning starvation wages, and I underline that, starvation wages in this country. I'd love to hear anybody get up here and tell me that they could live on $7.25 an hour. They could live on $8 an hour. They could live on $9 an hour. You can't. And I've been all over this country, and I have talked to workers who are making $10, $11 an hour with tears streaming down their cheeks, telling me what it's like to work for starvation wages and try to raise your kids. So the time is long overdue. Last time this Congress passed an increase in the minimum wage was in the year 2007. 2007. It is time to raise the minimum wage. It is time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour. Now, later on today, or this evening, as part of my support for this enormously important piece of legislation as chairman of the Budget Committee, I will be speaking more about why we need to raise the minimum wage. But I want to focus on one part of the minimum wage bill that I have been hearing a little bit about in the last couple of days from some of my colleagues, and that is the provision to raise the tip wage, now the tip wage, so everybody understands it, is the minimum, federal minimum wage that applies to waiters and waitresses, barbers, hairstylists, parking attendants, and others. Fellow Americans, do you know what that federal minimum wage today is for that person who waits on your table at a restaurant? It is $2.12 an hour. Yeah, you heard me correctly. $2.12 an hour. And the proposal is part of the minimum wage bill, that amendment that I will be offering, that tip minimum wage will go up from $2.12 an hour to $14.95 an hour over a 7-year period, longer than the overall national minimum wage would go up. And this is something that clearly is desperately needed. Now, I know that here in Washington, at any time we bring forth serious and important legislation for working people, the big money interests get to work. And all of their lobbyists who make their 6 figures or 7 figures a year, they get to work on Congress and tell you why you can't do anything to protect the most vulnerable and hard-hit people in this country. So the National Restaurant Association, they are a very powerful lobbying organization. I guess they have been enormously successful because we've not raised the federal minimum wage since 2007. So this powerful lobbying organization is going around and they're telling members of the House and the Senate that raising the tipped wage is opposed by restaurant workers, and it would be harmful to the interest of waiters and waitresses and other people. That is not true. That is what lobbyists say, representing big money interests. That's what they are paid to say. But that is not what workers who wait on tables are telling us. One Fair Wage, an organization, a grassroots organization representing service employees, waiters, waitresses, and others, has just delivered to the White House a petition with 140,000 signatures on it from service workers who are demanding that they receive the same minimum wage as every other worker in this country. And polling among service employees and non-service employees also supports the reality that Americans want our waiters and our waitresses and other service employees to get a fair and equal minimum wage similar to what other low-wage workers are receiving. Now, I have heard from some who tell me that, people are waiting on tables, and by the way, I was one of the worst waiters in the history of the country, but I was a waiter a long time ago. I know a little bit about it. And I am hearing from some that waiters and waitresses, they're doing really well, making a whole lot of money, and they don't need an increase in the minimum wage. And let's be clear, when you talk about the restaurant and the hotel industry, you're talking about mass discrepancies in the kind of incomes that people receive. I will not deny for a second, my daughter worked in a fancy restaurant. She did quite well. So if you're working in a hotel, in a fancy restaurant where you have a menu that is quite expensive, you get a $100 meal, and you get 20% of it, that's $20, you're waiting on 3 or 4 tables, you're doing okay. I don't deny that for a second. And I wish those waiters and waitresses who work so hard a continued success. But let us be clear, not everybody works in a fancy restaurant or a big hotel which has a high-priced menu. You got a whole lot of people working in diners, working in working-class restaurants where the menu is not that fancy. And maybe it is $10 for lunch or $8 for lunch, and 20% of that is $1.60 on an $8 meal. And let us be very clear that when we talk about waiters and waitresses, some 70% of tip workers in this country are women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. In other words, women who are waitressing have a 3 times higher poverty rate than the rest of the U.S. workforces. Their tips are not keeping up with their needs. These women waitresses, use food stamps at double the rate of other workers in this country. And importantly, and increasingly so, amazingly, during this pandemic, waitresses suffer from the highest rates of sexual harassment of workers in any industry because they are forced to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families through the tips that they get. And we're hearing stories where people in a restaurant, guys in a restaurant, say, well, take your mask off. You want a tip? Let me see how you look. And clearly this is unacceptable behavior. I also want to point out that the idea of moving tip wages to the same level over a period, in this case 7 years, moving it to the same level as the overall minimum wage is not a radical idea. Ain't a Bernie Sanders idea. It already exists. I don't know if people know this. It already exists in 7 states. So in 7 states right now, people who work in the service industry, waiters, waitresses, and others, are getting the same minimum wage as all the workers in those states. And those states are California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Alaska, and Minnesota. 7 states already pay their service industry workers the same wages as they pay other minimum wage workers. And I should point out that all of these states experienced a growth in the number of small businesses and restaurants after they abolished the tip minimum wage. So they abolished the tip minimum wage. It did not drive restaurants out of business. In fact, in those states where the tip minimum wage equaled the general minimum wage, we saw a growth in the number of restaurants. And furthermore, to respond to another piece of misinformation, waiters and waitresses in these states received more in tips, not less. So the mythology that's going around here is that if we raise the minimum wage for waiters and waitresses, when somebody walks into a restaurant, they're going to be thinking, oh my goodness, this person is now making 10, 12 bucks an hour, I'm going to leave less of a tip. Ain't the way the world works. Let me also say a word about how the pandemic, which has impacted workers in every sector, but how it has impacted tipped workers. In many states where the tip minimum wage still exists, tip workers, and this is rather unbelievable, tip workers did not even qualify for unemployment. So we're talking now in this bill of substantially increasing unemployment, a $400 supplement, and we're talking about extending it to late August. But tip workers whose minimum wage is so low, they do not even qualify for unemployment. In an industry where more than 6 million workers have lost their jobs, and obviously we all know the restaurant and hotel industry has been terribly hard hit by the pandemic, more than 60% of sub-minimum wage earners could not get unemployment benefits because the state and federal government denied them benefits for not making enough earned income. You all got that? So we're talking about the need, and I certainly agree with that, to expand and extend unemployment benefits, but you got a whole lot of workers who are earning starvation wages who are not going to be eligible for unemployment. At the same time, as restaurants reopen, the CDC has declared restaurants as the most dangerous place to work. We all know that, it's obvious. You're coming face to face with your customers. And now servers in the midst of that are responsible. You're a waiter, you're a waitress. You are now responsible for telling somebody who walks into your restaurant that they must socially distance themselves or wear a mask, not necessarily a comfortable position for a worker dealing with a hostile customer. I would also add, as all of us are increasingly aware of sexual harassment in general in this country, that the restaurant industry has some of the highest rates of sexual harassment. In a workplace where 70% of the workers are women and where they rely on their customers to determine their wages because of tips, women are often expected to withstand sexual harassment in order to get those tips. In states where the sub-minimum wage has been eliminated, sexual harassment has been cut substantially because women no longer have to take that. It's not an all or nothing proposition. So I'm going to be, if you ask me again, what the major economic crisis facing this country, we know unemployment is sky high. We know income inequality is unacceptable. And so many other factors are out there about the economy. But at the top of my list is the fact that tens of millions of workers in the richest country on earth are barely making it. They're having a hard time feeding their kids. They're having a hard time paying their rent. Many of them get inadequate or no health insurance at all. Now, year after year, the American people, I think, correctly perceive that this Congress bows to the wishes of the rich and the powerful, give tax breaks to people who don't need it, we deregulate companies that should be regulated, et cetera, et cetera. In this moment of economic and health crisis, now is the time for us to stand with working families. And the most important thing that we can do is to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. This is what Joe Biden believes. This is what the Democratic platform stands for. And this is what at least 38 co-sponsors of Raise the Wage Act also believe. So here we are in a pivotal moment. The working class is being decimated. People are struggling to feed their kids. We've got to raise wages in this country, and we have got to raise the wages of tip workers. I'll be back later for more on this, but thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
I would ask unanimous consent to add a letter about tip wages signed by hundreds of organizations to my remarks.
Without objection?
Thank you.
So ordered.